Welcome once again to the folks who have stayed with us throughout the day. Thank you for staying with us. For the folks who are new in the room or the folks who are new online, welcome. Once again, I am Dr. Christopher Witt, the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at DU. And I'm just so happy to see so many people engaged, to see the work continuing. And as I said this morning, one of the things that was really a big draw for me in coming to the University of Denver a year ago was the fact that we have something like IRISE, that we have something where we're very considerate and thoughtful about those intersections of justice work, of DEI and scholarship, along with really combining that with outreach to the community and collaboration with broader communities, really looking at ways in which we can broaden our footprint in this important work. So once again, I thank you all for being here. I thank the IRISE team. I thank everyone in the DEI team as a whole who helped make this happen. And I will now pass it to my great colleague, Marinka.
Thank you, Chris. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, Chris mentioned it, but our events today for the Climate Justice Series are actually kicking off the 21st Summit hosted by the University of Denver, and that will continue tomorrow and into the day after that, so through the 14th, and you can find the whole schedule outside next to that pillar if you're here in person right now. And so please check out those other events too. Today is our last event to kick off the first day. And I will be introducing Dr. Nadia Kim. If you were with us the other parts of the day, you got to hear a little bit about what she's going to talk about in more detail. Her recent publication, Refusing Death, Immigrant Women and the Fight for Environmental Justice in Los Angeles. Dr. Kim is a professor of Asian and Asian American Studies and Sociology at Loyola Marymount University. Loyola Marymount University. If you see me, I'm halfway through my afternoon coffee, so that's not enough caffeine for today. But I'll just stop talking then, and Dr. Kim, whenever you're ready, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to IRISE, Marinka, Tom, and everybody for being here. I know it's been a long day, and I know you guys are busy, could be doing anything else with your time, so I'm very, very grateful. So the talk today, as you see on the slide, is called Refusing Death, and it does draw from my recent publication. And I am going to be focusing on select parts of the book. I did combine. And I'm going to be focusing on how LA's Asian and Latina immigrant women basically fight for environmental justice and against environmental racism and classism, often by way of thinking through the body, inequalities and injustices of the body, emotions, and discussing like what is morality, right? Like who are the citizens and what is authentic, true citizenship in the United States, which is important given that many of the, especially Latina immigrant activists are unauthorized, okay? So I want to start off with the why does this matter part, and if any of you guys have confusion or need clarification or have questions, please feel free to save that for the Q&A. We're going to definitely have an extensive Q&A at the end. So one of the first things I want to mention is that if we care about issues of race, racism, and white supremacy, we have to center environmental racism within that. We can't understand the first without the latter, okay? And similarly, we can't understand class injustice without centering environmental injustice. And in this way, we are actually also grasping all dimensions of climate justice, right? When we think about climate catastrophes and climate justice, we kind of think about like environmental natural disasters that kind of happen out there. But what we need to remember is that it's actually our urban, especially communities of color, immigrant communities of color, as well as rural, right, who are often suffering the worst of climate catastrophes, okay? And so we've already kind of gotten the alarmist warnings, but I want to underscore that we really need to take these seriously. And I love Beyonce's song, Ring the Alarm, and I always think of her song every time I think about, we need to ring the alarm and really think about how understanding this and hopefully translating it into everyday and systemic action is going to really address climate justice in the ways we need to, okay? Now, the other reason studying this matters is because it's important to understand the context in which the Asian American Pacific Islander, especially women, and the Latina women that I studied in Los Angeles are fighting, okay? So the broader context is the violence and neglect that comes from neoliberal racial capitalism and the violence and neglect that comes from the rise in anti-immigrant nationalism. So let me start with the latter. Many of you are very, very familiar with the term like white nationalism, right? And essentially what white nationalism is the belief that the United States was, is, and should be a white country, okay? So no people of color, no immigrants, you know, make America great again, okay? Which is really make America white again, okay? And so not only are these immigrant activists, you know, fighting for justice under this wave and this, you know, growing wave of white nationalism, or what I like to call white racist nationalism, because they pretend it's about culture, we know better, right? But they're also fighting under this system called neoliberalism. And I'm just gonna give a very, very quick definition because it's, you know, kind of it can be a confusing word and concept. But to simplify it, essentially what it is that starting in about the 1980s, under the Reagan era, we moved to really skewing the system even more towards Wall Street, corporate America, and industry, okay? And so what that involved was this idea of kind of like runaway capitalism, where we no longer need the social welfare policies and programs that were necessary to deal with the inequalities that capitalism breeds. I mean, we have to understand that they were even knowledgeable that capitalism breeds poverty, right? It breeds a major wealth gap of the 1% versus the 99. They knew all that, right? So they set up, you know, social safety net, Medicare, Social Security, social welfare programs for housing, education, health, right? Welfare, right? And decided around that time to start gutting it, okay? And even, you know, corporations started privatizing it and making money off of that, right? And you guys are probably most familiar with that with the prison industrial complex, right? Now prisons make money, are traded on the stock market, right? So as part of that, it's people and women of color, immigrants, refugees of color that have been hit the hardest by, you know, this runaway profiteering and the gutting of the social welfare state, okay? So the other thing that has been a major part of it is weak to no regulation, okay? So if you favor industry and Wall Street, it's not just that you basically form all these policies that cater to them, but you basically allow them to exploit laborers, exploit the environment in greater and greater degrees, okay? So that's why so many of the Asian American Pacific Islander and Latina immigrants and their neighbors have gotten so sick because there's such weak regulation of the toxins and the emissions that come out of oil refineries, oil drums and drills that come out of the freeways in terms of diesel, et cetera, okay? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, I've mentioned this already, but increasingly in our global cities, it's been immigrant women of color, many of whom are unauthorized, that are at the forefront of these community grassroots movements. Again, we know very little about them, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, in LA, we focus on celebrity culture, the glitterati, Kim Kardashian, Kobe Bryant, Justin Bieber, right? But we don't focus on, you know, especially women, immigrant women of color that are really fighting for a change, okay? The other point about why this matters is that immigrant-led movements are among the most dynamic in our global cities, like LA, like cities like Denver. They're really changing the political landscape, but yet, you know, they're still unknown despite that, right? The other factor that I want to underscore is that we cannot grasp the COVID-19 global pandemic without centering environmental racism and classism. And the main reason for that is, why is it that it's Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, and Indigenous people that are getting the sickest, right, and hospitalized the most and dying in the largest numbers from COVID-19? And that's because these are the communities that have suffered the worst environmental injustices, and therefore their bodies are sickened, right? So we need to make that connection more and more. And I think that's what makes climate justice issues, environmental racism, and classism issues more like real and grounded, right, for people, as opposed to something that kind of happens in nature out there, okay? So what was the research question that animated this study? What I wanted to really understand is that when it comes to these environmental justice activists, right, how does the fact that these immigrants having unhealthy bodies, how does that shape the kinds of political lines that they draw, right? So when I say boundary lines, I mean, like, how do they think about who us is, who them are, right? What are we fighting for? What are we fighting against? For what purpose, right? And I was really interested in the sub-question, which is how do race, class, immigration, gender shape these political views, identities, and strategies? Now, just to let you know, I'm gonna be focusing more on race and class today, but if you're interested, you know, immigration, gender is more detailed throughout the book, okay? I'm gonna race through this a little bit just for lack of time, but just to kind of give a broad overview of what I did in terms of data collection and methodology, is I conducted about 3.5 years of ethnography. So I immersed myself in the actual goings-on of the movement, and I did everything from attending meetings to taking part in protests to going to social events where the activists gathered and had fun with each other and tried to do some self and collective care together, right? I also did interviews with almost 50 activists, and I also did a lot of documents analysis where I just went through pages and pages of agendas, presentations, flyers, reports. Now, I just want to make very, very clear that the two groups, which are mostly AAPI on one side and Mexican American predominantly on the other side, they mostly organized separately. So this wasn't a coalition-based movement by any means, okay? And that's because they tended to focus on different neighborhoods. And as you know, there's a great deal of residential and ethnic segregation, right? So most of the AAPIs were actually Filipinx, and they live in Carson, which is very close to this whole oil, diesel kind of vortex, right? And then the Mexican-American activists mostly lived in West Long Beach and in Wilmington. Those are working class Mexican and other Latinx immigrants, many of whom are unauthorized, also very close to the oil and diesel and port vortex, okay? So I'll just get into that in a moment, okay? So when I'm talking about this vortex, what am I talking about? Well, many of the sources of pollution that affect all of us, but disproportionately affect communities of color, many of whom are immigrant, in global cities like LA, are, for example, the train, truck, and port pollution. So these three are major sources of diesel pollution that happen because you and I need to buy stuff, right? Whether it's at Target or Costco or furniture stores or car dealerships, clothing stores, whatever it is. Since the US is no longer a manufacturing economy and has shipped out most of its manufacturing jobs to the global south, right, or China, all that stuff has to be shipped over there to here, right? And as many of you know, China's not close, right, where a lot of stuff is manufactured. Think about how long it takes to get on a plane. Imagine carting all those goods on a cargo container ship, emitting diesel the whole time, okay? And this is daily, right, nonstop, given our consumption habits. Then the goods that you and I buy are loaded onto trucks, like here, that also run on diesel, and also onto trains that also run on diesel, okay? Now this matters because where are most freeways placed or built, where are most rail yards placed? They're placed next to these communities of color, okay? The other thing they're contending with is oil refineries, okay, is pictured here. As you can see, they're literally abutting residential neighborhoods. If you actually drive through Wilmington and areas nearby like Carson, you have actual oil drills pumping in people's backyards, okay? You have them pumping in a hospital parking lot. Can you imagine the paradox of a hospital with an oil drill right there, which is causing the health problems that the hospital's trying to fix, right? In the middle of a church, next to a school, next to a boys and girls club. I mean, the amount of toxins released and the danger is it can't be underappreciated, okay? This is just a picture of the Port of LA and Long Beach, and one of the reasons why it's so important to show this to you is because this is the 5th largest port in the world, many have reported. It's definitely the largest in North America, and a lot of goods that you buy in Denver come through this port, okay? So lots of diesel pollution, okay? Now, I know this is a very poor map, and I'm sorry, I'm just not the most tech-savvy person. I'm a little dinosaurish. But a lot of you know LAX, right? So just to give you an orientation, this is LAX, and this is the Port of LA and Long Beach. You see it right here, right? And you can see all these freeway arteries, right, that take the goods that are unloaded from China and other manufacturing nations, and they go up these freeways. Now, the 710 right here is actually the most cancerous freeway in the entire United States, okay, running through communities of color, okay? And in fact, one of the fights that these immigrant and other of color activists waged was against the widening of this freeway so that more Mack trucks could rumble up the freeway, bringing more goods, right, at a higher rate, okay? So one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that freeways are among the most racist monuments that we have in our country. We often think of, you know, Confederate statues as our most racist monuments. Statues of our slave-owning political leaders in the past. Yes, those are racist, right? But actually, freeways can be considered among our most racist monuments because they're always built in and through communities of color. And many environmental justice fights waged by Black, Latinx, AAPI communities have been against the freeway building that splits apart and displaces their community, okay? But yet, not only are these freeways running in and through their communities and displacing people, but they're built right next to sensitive receptors. So what do I mean by sensitive receptors? Sensitive receptors are schools, hospitals, senior centers, daycare centers, right? And yeah, a lot of them are built right next to them, okay? So one of the first, major findings I wanted to focus on was the fact that under this kind of like neoliberal racial capitalism I was talking about earlier, one of the strategies that big oil and gas have used, as well as the quote unquote government agencies that regulate them, right, is they use emotional power, emotive power, you can call it affective power. And I argue that we really need to start focusing on the way in which emotive power has also become institutionalized, right? It's not just something that is like in your and my individual personalities, right? We often individualize emotions and emotional life. But it is really structural and systemic. So one of the first ways that we see this is that although it's been environmental justice movements that have been, the ones that have really focused on an ethics of care, right? And an ethics of concern for my children, for my neighbors, for my residents, my fellow residents, right? And it's largely because women and mothers have been at the forefront of these movements. What ends up happening is that, oil and gas and the state will kind of co-opt that ethics of care, and they'll appropriate it, and they'll say, oh, we really care. We care about environmental injustice. We care about, sickening the bodies of the community residents nearby. And so in many ways, they're co-opting the movement, okay? So that's one of their kind of emotionally manipulative power tactics, right? One of the ways that they, feign this ethics of care and concern is that they always talk about how they're working towards fixing the problem, right? We're working towards fixing the problem. But in talking about praising themselves for all the work they do on, we've been lowering emissions, we started using more, biofats and fuels in our plants, and we're using less water, and we have astroturf instead of real grass, blah, 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 right? They never actually admit that we've created this problem of the climate catastrophe as big oil and gas, right? They never admit that we're the reason why all these residents are sick and the children are asthmatic, which disproportionately affects communities of color, okay? And the other thing that ends up happening is that they'll say, we're so concerned about you that we are going to fund your schools and give lots of money to the hospitals in your community and to the senior centers and to the police department and the firefighters, right? But what they're really doing is they're doing that so that those institutions won't fight them and won't try to oust them from their communities, okay? Again, a very powerful tactic of emotional manipulation, okay? One of the other ways that you see the emotional power of big industry and of the regulatory government agencies is that they often present the community residents with very false choices, right? So a perfect example is this story that I came across in my research, which is that, you know, for the longest time, all these community organizations, they would always fight a school being sited right next to the freeway, right? And so there was a new school that was gonna be built, and guess where? Right next to the freeway, right? And so, you know, Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma were like, okay, like pro forma, we're gonna block it, right? But the mothers like, no. So these are mostly the undocumented Latina immigrant mothers. They said, no, let the school be built because it's within walking distance, okay? And many of them don't have cars or ready modes of transportation, right? So they have to pick between sickening and possibly causing premature death to their children and being able to educate their children and walk to that educational institution, right? That's a false choice. It doesn't have to be that way, right? It's a false choice because A, we don't even have to rely on oil and gas as an energy source. We don't, right? B, you don't have to build a school right next to the freeway, right? These are false choices, false binaries, okay? So one of the ways in which Valero Oil, for example, shows you this ethics of care and concern is on their website, they're gonna tout, we ranked highest among independent refiners in Newsweek's magazine's green rankings of top 500 companies for environmental performance. So is the irony lost on us that this is a fossil fuel oil and gas company boasting about how green they are, right? When they're responsible for most of the climate catastrophe itself, right? And so I always joke that this reminds me, this could be like Coca-Cola boasting about how, you know, they rank in the top, you know, rankings in terms of health performance, right? Like, they're the reason for so much health maladies in the United States, right? And so, I mean, they're so lost in their own like belief in their humanity and morality that they don't even see how asinine this is, right? We need to like take that into consideration. Here's another really important historic example of the way in which the school system and environmental justice issues are inextricable, okay? And one of the reasons I want to bring this up is because these women and mothers, as activists, they bring a brand new perspective and a brand new type of activism because they're also very much invested in their children going to school and doing well in school, as we just heard, right? But how can their kids learn and do well in school if, for example, it's right next to a chrome plating factory, right? And this is an infamous case in Bell Gardens, which is a mostly Latinx working class community, you know, in the sort of south and east part of LA, where for decades this chrome plating factory was just blowing cancerous, dangerous toxins onto these kids as they played in the schoolyard, okay? And as they were trying to go to school. To this day, I believe there are upwards of 26 teachers and children that have already died of cancer because of this chrome plating factory right next to Suva, okay? And yet, despite all the activism by Communities for a Better Environment, which is one of the groups I worked with, and decades of lawsuits, it took forever to get this chrome plating factory shut down, okay? So one of the most important, I think, points that I drew from the interviews in my ethnography was this notion that we, as people of color, immigrants of color, women and mothers, embody our own community. So Johnny, who was a youth leader, he's unauthorized, he's Guatemalan. You know, I thought he said it so beautifully, and they all kind of echoed something similar to what he said. And this is his response to my question about how does environmental justice play into your life and activism. He said, EJ is not an identity, right? People don't see that as an identity, like being Guatemalteco or Chicano, but to me it is. It has so much to do with where I live, where I grew up in the US. That's why I hold environmental justice dear to my heart, EJ allowed me to do that without having to focus on just one identity. That should be one. It's that I'm part of my community and my environment and my surroundings, which is not just pollution, by the way. He was acknowledging the beauty of his community, all the positives as well. But regardless, I can't take the community away from me. And I thought this was so powerful because essentially what he was saying is that normally when we think of identity, we think of race, class, gender, sexual identity, right? But he's like, but we don't think about environmental justice, right? But just like my race or my gender, I can't take my community out of me. It is me, right? Because whether it's the pollution and the illness that comes from that, or whether it's the beauty of love and collective support, all of that is in me and I can't take it away, okay? So we are the embodied community. We embody our community, and that's a centerpiece of our politics, okay? So in this context, how do the activists actually see racism and classism when thinking about their politics and drawing political lines? And what was fascinating is that they really defined their community as embodying classism and as embodying racism. But it didn't stop there. They also believed that their community embodied those emotional inequalities that I just mentioned, right? Which is that not only do we have to deal with those emotional structures that the government and corporate America impose on us, right? And use to prematurely kill us, right? But we also have to deal with the emotional inequalities that exist between those who live in cleaner communities, right? And those who have to live in more polluted communities. So they have less stress than us, less anxiety, less depression. They have less emotional work to do to help support the community, right? We don't have that privilege. So they were very much aware that they embodied that lack of privilege emotionally as well. The last part of this, and that I have here, is that they believe by providing the emotional support, the caring for other people's bodies, including their children's and their neighbors, that they are practicing what's true, authentic moral citizenship, right? Citizenship, we usually think of it as voting, right? Civic duties for the government, right? They're like, no, right? Citizenship to us is caring for your neighbor, right? Especially under a neglectful and violent system, also emotionally, okay? So interestingly enough, when they were kind of thinking about who is us and who is them, right? For the Latinx immigrants in particular, they talked about they're the healthy, wealthy, right? We are not, right? When I asked the AAPI immigrants, they often focused on they're the white healthy and we are the non-white unhealthy, okay? They're immoral, we actually care about morality, okay? So as a part of my project and talk today, what I wanted to focus on was for the Filipinx, Asian Americans, which were the most, the majority of the AAPI activists, racism to them was more salient as a problem and as the, political problem to slay. And I want to explore a little bit why. For the Mexican Latinx activists, it was mostly classism, okay? That was most salient to them, and I want to share a little bit about why. I can't go into the whole argument, but I do want to give you some of that. I'm going to start with the mostly Mexican Latinx activists, okay? One of the reasons why they thought class injustice was the main cause of the pollution and the health problems was because of the transnational lens that they used, okay? So interestingly, what is the injustice that they suffered the most back in Mexico? It was poverty, okay? So then transnationally, they come to the United States and they experience poverty again, right? So it makes sense that that becomes a focal point, right? So interestingly, and this surprised me, I did not expect to necessarily find this, but I said, why do you think the government here or the corporate officials here, they don't do anything when you go there and you testify and you cry and you have your children and they're asthmatic? Why do they not do anything, right? And I remember asking, do you think it's because they're Anglo and you're Latinx, right? And Marta, who is an unauthorized Mexican immigrant, she said it's not just because they're Anglo. Over there in Mexico, we're Mexican, and it's the same thing when there's politics. They don't pay attention to us. To put it simply, they're people who are not in a lower class like us. Again, the focus on class, okay? They separate themselves from us, and they don't know the people. They live near the mountains, i.e. in the beautiful neighborhoods high up in the hills, and forget about us, okay? And so this focus on class and class injustice as the major reason for disproportionate contamination, right? Environmental injustice was striking, and a lot of people echoed this, okay? So similarly, I talked to Lauda. Lauda was one of the community liaisons for a Long Beach organization, and her comments could be sort of summarized as embodied classism binds my community, who we are, right? Who I'm fighting for. So when they kept using the word community, this is at the beginning of my research, I said, when you say community, do you mean the people who live in the area or Lauda? No, not only as immigrants, it's low income. I'm not talking about Latinos, Black, or other racial ethnic groups who live here. I'm talking about the low income, okay? And one of the ways in which they made clear that they saw the wealthy, the class elite, as being not just physically healthier, but emotionally healthier. But because they were healthier, they were also ignorant of what was going on for the non-healthy, and they were also not empathic about it, okay? And for women activists in particular, mothers in particular, this is a big deal to be empathic, to care for others, right? To be concerned for the collective outside of yourself, okay? So this kind of came out in an unrelated question and discussion. So I asked Lauda, who had just told me she really loved Obama, right? When he was a candidate and became president. I said, you love Obama, so would you ever focus more on electoral politics, right? As opposed to grassroots organizing, knocking on doors, organizing everyday people. And Lauda replied, never. My community is first. It's because the community needs to be educated, we need to include ourselves. I said, do you feel like President Obama or the national government level, representatives, do they know local issues? She scoffs, no. They have no idea because they live in places where they don't know anything about pollution, okay? They're ignorant and not empathic precisely because they have physical and emotional health privilege, okay? I just want to share a picture with you of some of the activists in action. This was when we were trying to fight the building and the expansion of a rail yard. Remember, rail yards emit a lot of diesel. They're built right next to these Latinx communities, okay? Now, when we turn to the AAPI activists who are mostly Filipinx, they actually lead with environmental racism, okay? So they lead with our Filipino community, we minorities, we people of color, and then they'll invoke class, right? So one of the ways in which this happened, and Pia right here on the left, this is when she was younger, she's one of the lead organizers in Carson, and is a major organizer for People's Corps. She and the others rarely organize an environmental justice event without also centering Phil-Am, Panay, Pinoy history and culture in some way, shape, or form. So they had Filipinx food, they had Filipinx civic awards, they had like knowledge about Filipinx leaders. Now one of them is Larry Itliong. Do any of you guys know Larry Itliong or you've heard of Larry Itliong? No? Larry Itliong is actually someone who's now commemorated by a day in Carson and will probably be commemorated by a day in California, given the push for ethnic studies. People always think it was Cesar Chavez who decided to strike, and make the farm workers strike, right? In order to have livable conditions, to get a fair wage, to be able to get benefits and possibly organize a union, right? Actually, Cesar Chavez was very reticent about striking. It was Larry Itliong, Philip Veracruz, and the other Filipino Manongs who actually had to convince Cesar Chavez, let's organize the Mexican and Filipinx farm workers to just walk off the job. Yes, they'll hire scabs and strike breakers, but we're gonna try to get them organized too, right? And it was because of that that the United Farm Workers became a union and a massive movement in California and US history, okay? Later leading to a very successful boycott of grapes, the list goes on, okay? So one of the other reasons, again, similar to the Mexican case for class, is transnationality was a big factor in making the Filipinx and AAPI immigrants focus on race and racism as the major political beast, okay? One of the reasons for that was the Filipinx and AAPI focus on colonialism, okay? So for example, Pia shares this experience and engagement of not just US colonialism in her country, but the ways in which she saw, examples of environmental imperial racism there and examples of environmental injustice locally here in the United States. So she starts off by saying, my dad was a union leader. I grew up debating politics. My political position was in the student movement in the 70s, fighting the Marcos dictatorship, US installed dictator. I was already active with the women's movement in '84 in the Philippines. Right now, because we live in Carson, right, in that vortex, right, I'm more interested in the environment because I can feel the impact. She had constant bloody noses, would faint a lot, nausea. The Philippine network pulled out when the US military bases pulled out of the Philippines in '92. When they pulled out, we felt that it was necessary to put up an environment group because the human rights had gone hand in hand with the environment issue. So she's basically saying human rights in the Philippines go hand in hand with environmental justice, right? Same thing she's dealing with here locally in the US. And I asked her, are you saying this because the US bases had polluted so much in the Philippines? And she says, yeah. And though we were wanting to do just international issues, we got pulled in because Greenpeace came in and we talked about plastics, that the global north dumps plastics in the Philippines. They dump their batteries, the pesticides go there. They dump all the tobacco from here in the US over there. So you see here that she has a very strong notion of the racism embedded in neocolonialism and the racism embedded in Carson as causing the environmental injustices, okay? Now there's other factors that pinpoint the racism. I don't have time to go into this here, but if you want to know in the Q&A, I'd be more than happy to talk about it. But what I want to also underscore is that just because the mostly Mexican Latinx immigrants in the EJ movement led with class, and just because the AAPI, mostly Filipinx immigrant activists led with race, that doesn't mean that the other, the outstanding injustice was left out. It wasn't. It's that they felt that the dominant master injustice mediated the other one, okay? So as an example, Celia talks about how she thinks that the class injustice is what's mediating the race injustice. So when I asked Celia, I said, why do you think that they disproportionately pollute your neighborhood? She says, it can be because they might think that immigrants only come to take from the country and not give to the country. So I said, so sometimes you do think it has to do with being Latino and Celia said, yes, right? Similarly, Cindy, who is a Samoan American, a Pacific Islander, she always led with race and racism and white supremacy, but she also made sure to say, one of the reasons that Samoans and other AAPIs are hyper-contaminated is because, quote, America has false images of Samoans as just being uneducated football players, right? So she's not just concerned that they're stereotyping Pacific Islanders as football players, but that they're seen as uneducated, right? And throughout our interview and the 3.5 years I spent with her, she was always telling me, look, Samoan Americans are so misunderstood and stereotyped. There's tons of us who are getting PhDs, highly educated, we care about college. It's a total sham, right? So to conclude, what are the implications of my findings, right? And I'll go through these relatively quickly, but one thing that came to me is that it is possible that given the lack of connection between universities and the surrounding communities, we as university theorists can be too race-focused when perhaps street theorists are not, right? And these Latinx immigrants have their own reasons for why they decide to focus on poverty and class as mediating race, right? In this light, I believe we need more inter and multidisciplinary work. That was the only way I came to my findings. So I did not just draw on sociology. I did not just draw on the sociology of environmental injustice or the sociology of the environment. I made sure to draw on similar or related work in ethnic studies, meaning Asian AAPI studies, Latinx Chicano studies, right? American studies. Women's and gender studies. If I had not done that, I don't think I would have been able to really draw in sort of the morality and emotional tropes that were so important to EJ organizing, okay, and dealing with neoliberal racial capitalism. The other thing is I believe that sociology and environmental justice scholarship in general need to take more into account how racism, classism, et cetera, are thoroughly embodied, right? And involves bodily injustices and bodily hierarchies. That includes emotional, affective hierarchies, right? We also need to be more transnational. We're often so bounded, to the nation state as a singular entity, right? We need to be more focused on imperialism. And we need to focus on citizenship. We need to center neoliberalism. The list goes on and on. I know it's long. And I know we're moving slowly in this direction, but we need to center it more, okay? And all these disciplines need to engage each other more. Finally, I believe we're still too methodologically nationalistic. What does that mean? That means, going back to my earlier point, that we still focus too much on a singular bounded nation state without really focusing on the imperial, colonial, and transnational history that traverses borders, right? Not to mention global capitalism, right? But also that we don't do enough work on connecting local communities to broader discussions of the nation or the globe. But I think these activists, whether it's Pia talking about Carson and connecting Carson to the Philippines, or it's these Latinx activists who connect the poverty in Mexico to the poverty here in LA, we really need to be connecting the local to the global and transnational, okay? So a perfect example, I think future research, it'd be fascinating if they could study the way that Mexico treat and talk about their impoverished, right? And are there similarities or differences in the way we talk about our impoverished, including Mexican immigrants here in the United States? Thank you so much for listening, for your time, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you. Or if you need me to clarify anything, I'd be more than happy to. Okay.
So you mentioned at the beginning the impacts on COVID on communities. It might be too soon to study this, but
okay.
since there was such an increase in demand for shipping,
Yeah.
do you think that'll have even more implications in the future?
Oh,
with-
definitely, yeah.
with more.
Yeah, no, that's a really important question too, because did you guys heard all about the supply chain logjam, right? When American consumers were up in arms because their Amazon boxes were taking too long to get to them, and people were worried their holiday gifts wouldn't arrive in time, right, for the holidays. You know, one of the things that ended up happening is that because there was like this massive influx of ships, right, and then trucks and trains having to cart all that product, that not only did diesel emissions skyrocket during that time, right, but that you had so much more dangerous road conditions because trucks started like driving off their normal path, and they were driving through the Latinx and AAPI communities, right? And getting in massive accidents because they're not supposed to be on these small roads, right? And, you know, disrupting, you know, neighborhood life, and children weren't able to play in the streets. And some people, because their houses are literally right on the street where all that goods movement is funneled, they didn't leave their house because it was just so dangerous, and like the flow of traffic was so massive, right, and constant. Their houses are literally shaking, like the air is so bad they can't go out to exercise or walk. And what amazed me is that not only did you see an increase in shipping because of the need for COVID supplies, right, and you know, all the other equipment that was needed to deal with the crisis, but you also saw like the fact that there was that log jam causing this like massive uptick, right, in goods movement. And almost nowhere in the news, right, do you even hear about this? I mean, how many of us read countless news stories about how much immigrants, communities of color were suffering, right, because of this goods movement? So, you know, this is one of the ways in which hopefully we can continue to not just make those connections, but really raise consciousness among the American public so that it's no longer, oh, poor consumers. Like literally the stories were focused on those poor consumers. What are you gonna do, you know? You gotta buy more gifts, oh no, right? Or you gotta actually visit a brick and mortar store, you know? Or the other set of news stories, you know what they were about? They were like, Amazon is finding a way around the supply chain logjam. They're doing X, Y, and Z, and they're so skillful, right? Like all these companies have decided to build their own container shipping, you know, yards to deal with the extra containers coming in. I mean, that was the focus. And hopefully, given symposia like these, right, and increasing ring the alarm attention to climate justice, I'm really hoping that we can really now be focusing on how this is prematurely killing and sickening, especially people of color, and women and mothers are really fighting back the hardest. So, yeah, thanks for that great question. Yeah, Marinka.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
No problem.
My question is, so as you were talking, your study, your research focuses specifically on women, on immigrant mothers and women, and I'm wondering if, because my thought is, okay, what else do moms do? And
they do everything.
Everything, right? And my question is, I'm thinking about the events we have this week as part of, the summit and the Climate Justice series. I'm thinking about the Youth vs. Gov documentary showing last night, trying to convince my own teenager to be aware of her privilege and that it's a privilege to even choose to think about these things.
Exactly.
And so I was wondering if in over the 3.5 years you got to know these amazing women, if you also happen to observe or hear, because they talked about this being a morality, right? And in that way, I'm wondering if there's this kind of generational passing this on.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that is something that you noticed or came up in conversation.
Most definitely. I talk about that most in the second to last chapter of my book, so I try to focus on the youth, but I also deal with kind of that intergenerational activism, right, and that intergenerational transmission. And what's so interesting is that many of the children of the first generation, the parent activists, right, actually do get involved because they are the ones attending with their mothers the public testimonies, right, where they have to basically yell at or cry in front of, right, the oil and gas or the port officials, Caltrans, Metro, right, and the regulatory agencies. And I always put that in quotes because they're not really regulating, right? And they recognize how, irrespective of whether you speak English, right, irrespective of whether you have moved beyond a primary school education, kind of what Ian was talking about today, that you do have the ability to exercise your voice and emote and share your story and validate that story as important and legitimate, right? And I think the children, because they, always flank their mothers at all these different organizing events and meetings and planning meetings and all that it does become a form of socialization. And so what's interesting is that they're not really that interested in other forms of politics, and we were talking about this earlier too. They're not as interested in voting. They will if they absolutely have to, and it's a really crucial issue, but they're just not as into it, right? They're not that interested in officials outside of the local jurisdiction, because the local jurisdiction is what affects them the most, right? They're most interested in grassroots organizing, going out, knocking on doors, talking to everyday average people, right? Talking to them at the parks, at the schoolyard, at the laundromat, at church, right? At social gatherings. That's what they're most interested in. And I find that really fascinating because so much of our research and our focus, sometimes in policy, is let's get immigrants assimilated into the political system. Let's get youth assimilated into the political system. But they're not interested in doing that. And it's because they really see the system as broken, right? And they see the system as basically violent and neglectful. So why would you invest all your time and energy into that a system that's constantly surveilling and deporting them, right? Or trying to, right? And caging, right? And so, I think what's interesting is that it's a socialization that's passing down grassroots activism and grassroots organizing politics. Now, the other aspect of that is there's a lot of youth separate from their parents that are also being organized. And a great organization that I worked with, I focused mostly on watching and working with their youth program, is Communities for a Better Environment. So they'll go into the middle schools and high schools, and they'll start teaching them, why do you think you have asthma, right? Why do you think you have lung disease? Why do you have all these bloody noses and nausea? Why do you faint on a regular basis? You think that's just genetic or individual or happenstance? No, it's because of these oil refineries, these ports, these freeways, blah, 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 right? And they're actually doing a great job organizing youth of color. And these youth of color are so powerful. They're so knowledgeable. And, yes, do they have to get over the fears and the insecurity and the lack of confidence? Absolutely. But through the stages of politicization, they become such powerful activists. Many of them are now leaders themselves, running organizations, right? And But the problem with that is that because big oil funds a lot of these schools, that's their emotional manipulation, right? They fund these Halloween carnivals for the community. They give out free backpacks and school supplies, right? It's very manipulative, right? That the schools will often actively try to dissolve these CBE and other Communities for a Better Environment and other environmental justice organizations in the schools. So they're constantly having to fight that battle as well. But it almost energizes the youth to be more active, you know, and they get really angry and they organize. So when they organize together with their parents, it's an even more powerful concoction. So yeah. Yeah.
Nadia, thank you. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation and also for your call to push disciplinary boundaries.
Yes.
That's music to my ears to hear you say that. I had a slightly different question.
Yeah.
When you mentioned, for example, the 710, I believe,
Yes.
was
Yeah.
the highway that was the most
Yeah.
racist, cancerous, dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Have you been able to sort of map some of the health outcomes that are just sort of
Mm-hmm.
that characterize that neighborhood, life expectancy, deaths by cancer, asthma, and so forth? Because it seems like that's such an important part of your story as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And also you mentioned the teachers and children who had succumbed to cancer because they lived in close proximity to the chrome plating factory.
Yeah.
So have you been able to sort of map that, like what the difference between what that looks like and in area neighborhoods close by?
Yeah, you know what? I don't really have to map that because all that work has been done already. And, you know, in my book, what I wanted to do is I didn't want people to think of it as like an epidemiological focus. And so, and if I did too much of the focus on the numbers, like I knew that it might invite people thinking, okay, we want to know more about how, you know, numbers and like the demographics and the health impacts, you know, relate directly to activism, when I actually wanted to focus a little bit more on the meaning making they do, right, behind their activism, knowing that there's already disproportionate illness, right? But like, for example, Wilmington is like a community that has done a lot in terms of getting more attention to it and more regulation, because the Clean Air Act, this is literally the Clean Air Act, right? It says that there should only be 1 in 1,000 like cancer, or no, they actually say 1 in 1 million deaths caused by environmental pollution, right, related to cancer. Or they focus on just, there should only be like 1 in 1 million cancer cases that we can trace to environmental pollution. Obviously, it often leads to death. But in Wilmington, the number is actually 3 orders worse, which is like 1 in 1,000 people are getting cancer due to environmental pollution, right? And so because of that alarming rate, many of the Latinx immigrants and the organizers in Wilmington were able to get something like benzene regulated, right? Like benzene, which comes out of the oil refineries, never used to get regulated, right? And so when those kinds of statistics are shown or demonstrated, that's when sometimes you get piecemeal like concessions, right? Or you'll get a little bit more. Now, does that mean Wilmington has had all the problems solved with environmental justice? Absolutely not, right? But at least now the oil companies have to report benzene and basically have to try to, you know, get their in-house doctors or scientists to say, how is benzene related to some of the health problems in the community, right? In terms of asthma, in these communities, it's usually on the order of 30% higher than the average population in terms of contraction of asthma, right? And that also is similarly correlated to the number of hospitalizations related to asthma. So, you know, in terms of numbers, I don't have everything memorized, but I just know that the numbers are so stark and alarming that this is what often will be used as street science, right? And that sometimes does get some kind of concessions, not systemic solutions, but some kind of concessions. The other element to this is that, I'm trying to remember what I was thinking about health impacts. I'm not sure. Oh, the other way in which health has been impacted is that typically, right, the way that we do medicine in the United States is that we individualize all our symptoms, right? And even the way we teach medical students in medical school, it's like you look at a part of the body, but you look at it separate from the rest of the body, right? And you don't teach about socio-political causes of illness, right? And so the activism of these mothers and immigrants have really forced like doctors, right, and hospitals to contend with the socio-political environmental causes of illness and premature death, right? Whereas before, all they would do is say, your kid has asthma, here's albuterol or whatever, inhaler. Try not to have, triggers in your apartment. And the whole thing is individualized, right? But now actually, and obviously like low-income serving clinics have been doing this, inspired by these activists, but they're really now addressing holistically the body. And even talking about issues like, why is there obesity in the community? It's not just because of food desert or food insecurity, which is what most people think about, right? Or unhealthy cultural eating habits, right? Which one could consider the racial ethnic bias in that. It's because of environmental pollution, right? It's because of hypercontamination. These kids can't go out and exercise in that kind of air. So everything is interconnected, and it's really forced doctors to understand that and to take that into consideration. So, in terms of the relationship, I do think that the activists, especially the women and mothers, kind of going back to Marinka's question, they're concerned about health too, right? They've really forced that kind of reckoning, whereas it didn't exist before. So, yeah.
Well, I think we are at time.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful presentation and teaching. Thank you, Nadia. Let's give her a
Thank
big
you. Thanks
hand.
for having me.
Sort of finish us off in a couple different ways.
Sure.
One, I want to sort of highlight, this is a series of conversations that are actually began much earlier and will continue, I think, well into the future. All of today will be up on YouTube. Dr. Kim had a conversation with our Rage podcast host, Karis Fox. So there is, if you want to dig deeper into some of these issues, please check out the Rage podcast. There was also a conversation with Ian Thomas DeFoya, Miguel de la Torre, one of our co-sponsors for today from the Eco Justice Center at the ILIF School of Theology. So please continue to engage in these conversations. Continue to engage with us here at IRISE. We have a program that we're going to sort of be not launching, but continuing into the next year. And I was sort of really struck by Dr. Kim's idea, and I think the importance of highlighting the difference between sort of academic theory and street theory. I think it's a super important point, and I think particularly as we're thinking about the work of IRISE, those of us that are here, I think that is a nut we want to figure out how to crack. And so we have a program next year that we are going to be having 3 IRISE visiting community scholars, so we can engage collaboratively, right, and in community to bridge that gap between academic theory and street theory. And I think that will be, I think, really exciting. Finally, those of you that are in town and here tomorrow, there will be a book talk, another opportunity to dig deeper into these issues with Dr. Kim at the Tattered Cover at McGregor Square at 6 p.m. And finally, just want to give a big thank you to Marinka Swift, Dr. Swift, Karis Fox, the whole IRISE staff that has sort of been behind the scenes to make this possible. Community partners like Protejete and Green Latinos and so many others. So thank you all for coming, and again, continue to engage. This is not the end, but the continuing ongoing conversation. So thank you.